As the cleaning lady passed by, the millionaire froze when he saw a mark on her arm, identical to the one his daughter had when she was born. Thomas Blackwood looked out the window of his office, observing the city of Chicago below. It was a gray day, perfectly matching his mood. Today marked 30 years since he lost his wife and his newborn daughter mysteriously disappeared from the hospital. 30 years of pain, anger, and an endless search. "Mr. Blackwood," his secretary's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Your brother Richard is here for the meeting." Thomas sighed. "Send him in." Richard entered, smiling as always. "Thomas, my brother, how are you on this special day?" Thomas clenched his fists. "Let's get straight to the point, Richard. What do you want?" "Well, I've been thinking. The company is doing well, but we could expand more. How about investing in—" "No," Thomas interrupted. "We're not risking what we've built on risky projects." Richard frowned. "But Thomas, think of the possibilities. We've been stagnant for years because you refuse to take risks." I said no, Richard. This discussion is over. Meanwhile, across town, Emma Watson was running desperately to catch the bus. Her 5-year-old son Jake had another episode during the night, and she barely slept. Now she was late for her first day of work as a cleaning lady at the Blackwood mansion. "Please wait," she shouted, waving at the driver. To her relief, the bus stopped. Panting, Emma threw herself into a seat. Her hands trembled as she checked the address on her phone one more time. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Jake's treatment was expensive, and the bills were piling up. At the Blackwood mansion, Thomas was trying to focus on work, but his mind kept returning to that fateful day 30 years ago. The cry of a baby, the panic at the hospital, the desperate search that followed. How different his life could have been if— A noise pulled him out of his thoughts. Emma had arrived, late and out of breath. "Sorry, Mr. Blackwood," she said, breathless. "I had an emergency with my son and—" Thomas interrupted her with a gesture. "I don't want to hear excuses. Just do your job." Emma nodded, swallowing hard. She quietly began cleaning, conscious of Thomas's cold gaze on her. Hours passed. Thomas tried to work but couldn't concentrate. Frustrated, he got up to get more coffee. On his way, he bumped into Emma, spilling the hot cup on himself. "Damn it," he shouted, jumping back. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Emma exclaimed, quickly grabbing some napkins. She moved closer to help, extending her arm. That's when Thomas saw it. On the inside of Emma's arm, almost hidden, was a birthmark. 3 small stars in a row. The world seemed to stop. Thomas stood frozen, his eyes fixed on that mark. It was identical to the one his daughter had when she was born. Emma, noticing his gaze, pulled her arm back, confused. "Mr. Blackwood, are you all right?" Thomas didn't respond. His mind was spinning. Could it be possible? After all these years? "Mr. Blackwood," Emma repeated, worried. Thomas finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse. "Yes, I'm fine. You can go now." Emma hesitated, still confused, but nodded and quickly left. Alone, Thomas collapsed into his chair. His heart was pounding. That mark. It couldn't be a coincidence. Could Emma be his lost daughter? The idea was absurd, but he couldn't shake it. That night, Emma returned home exhausted. Jake greeted her with a tight hug. "Mommy, you took so long," he said, coughing lightly. Emma hugged him back, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. "Sorry, sweetheart. Mommy had to work a little more. How are you feeling?" Jake shrugged. "Tired. My chest hurts." Emma forced a smile. "Let's get your medicine, okay? And then I'll tell you a story." While taking care of Jake, Emma couldn't stop thinking about her new boss's strange behavior. Why had he been so disturbed when he saw her birthmark? Little did she know that, at that very moment, Thomas Blackwood was digging through old files, desperately searching for a picture of a baby with 3 stars on her arm. a search that would change their lives forever. Thomas couldn't sleep that night. The image of the mark on Emma's arm wouldn't leave his mind. The next morning, he called an old friend. "Mike, I need a favor," Thomas said. "I want you to look into someone for me, discreetly." Mike, a private investigator, agreed immediately. Thomas gave him Emma's information, stressing the importance of secrecy. Meanwhile, Emma arrived at the Blackwood mansion, feeling anxious after the strange encounter the day before. She began her chores, trying to avoid Thomas. Richard arrived shortly after, noticing his brother's distraction. "Thomas, we need to discuss the new contracts," he said, walking into the office. Thomas barely heard him, his eyes following Emma as she cleaned. Richard noticed and frowned. "Thomas, are you listening to me?" Richard pressed. Yes, Thomas murmured, finally turning to his brother. The meeting continued, but Thomas remained distracted. At one point, Emma entered to serve coffee. Richard watched the interaction between the two closely. That's when he saw it. As Emma leaned in to pour the coffee, her sleeve lifted slightly, revealing the birthmark. Richard froze, immediately recognizing its significance. After Emma left, Richard stared at Thomas. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. "Saw what?" "Don't play dumb, Thomas. The mark on her arm. It's the same as your daughter's." Thomas tensed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Richard laughed without humor. "Of course you do. Now, what are you going to do about it?" Thomas didn't answer, but his mind was racing. Richard left the office, worried. If Emma was truly Thomas's long-lost daughter, the entire inheritance would be at risk. Later that afternoon, while cleaning, Emma received a call from the hospital. She answered nervously. "Mrs. Watson," said the voice on the other end, "we need to discuss Jake's treatment. The bills are piling up, and without payment, we won't be able to continue his care." Emma's heart sank. "Please," she begged. "I just need more time. I've just gotten a new job." "I'm sorry, but without a substantial payment by the end of the week, we'll have to stop the treatment." Emma hung up, feeling desperate. She couldn't lose Jake's only chance. Thomas, passing by in the hallway, overheard part of the conversation. He hesitated, wanting to help but afraid of revealing his interest. That night, Mike called Thomas with the first findings. "She grew up in orphanages, Thomas. There are no records of her biological parents." Thomas felt a mix of hope and fear. Could it be true? His daughter so close after all these years? Emma returned home exhausted and worried. Jake was waiting for her, looking paler than usual. "Mom, when can I go back to school?" he asked. Emma forced a smile. "Soon, sweetheart. You need to get strong first." She hugged her son, fighting back tears. How could she tell him his treatment was at risk? Meanwhile, in his luxurious apartment, Richard was planning his next move. He couldn't let this housekeeper threaten his position. He needed to act, and fast. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the mansion early, eager to see Emma again. He watched her work, noticing her worried expression. "Emma," he called out, surprising himself. "Is everything all right?" She seemed surprised by the question. "Yes, sir. Everything's fine." Thomas knew she was lying, but he didn't push. He wanted to help but didn't know how without raising suspicion. Richard arrived soon after, noticing the interaction between Thomas and Emma. His eyes narrowed. He needed to get rid of this threat. As Thomas struggled with his conflicting feelings of hope and fear, Emma grew more desperate. The hospital's deadline was approaching, and she had no idea how she would get the money. Richard watched everything, his mind working on a plan. He wouldn't allow this woman to destroy everything he hoped to inherit. It was time to take drastic measures. That night, alone in his office, Richard made a call. "I need you to take care of something for me," he said in a low voice. "It's about a certain housekeeper." The plan was in motion. Richard smiled, satisfied. Soon, Emma Watson would be nothing more than a distant memory, and his future would be secure. Richard arrived early at the Blackwood mansion, carrying a small box. Inside was a diamond necklace that had belonged to his mother. He waited for the right moment, watching as Emma was distracted, cleaning Thomas's office. "Emma," Richard called as he entered the room. "Can you bring me a coffee, please?" As soon as Emma left, Richard acted quickly. He opened her purse and placed the necklace inside. His heart raced, but he remained calm. Everything was going according to plan. Meanwhile, Thomas was determined to get closer to Emma. He found her in the hallway and tried to start a conversation. "Emma, how's your son?" Thomas asked, catching her by surprise. Emma hesitated. He's struggling, sir." Thomas nodded, feeling uncomfortable. "If you need anything—" Before he could finish, Emma's phone rang. She answered, her face turning pale as she listened. "Jake?" Her voice trembled. "I'm coming right away." Emma turned to Thomas, panicked. "Sir, I need to go. My son—" "Go," Thomas said without hesitation. "Take care of him." Emma rushed to the hospital, her heart filled with fear. When she arrived, she found Jake in the ICU, struggling to breathe. "What happened?" she asked the doctor. "He took a sudden turn for the worse. We need to keep him in intensive care." Emma held Jake's hand, tears streaming down her face. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Mommy's here." Back at the mansion, Thomas couldn't focus. His thoughts were with Emma and her sick son. He wondered if he should help financially, but feared it would seem suspicious. Richard watched his brother with growing concern. Each day, Thomas seemed more interested in Emma. His plan had to work. At the hospital, Emma spent the night beside Jake. By morning, exhausted, she called Thomas. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry, but I can't come to work today. My son—" "Don't worry, Emma," Thomas interrupted. "Take care of him. Your job is safe." Emma felt a wave of gratitude. There was something in Thomas's voice that made her feel secure, despite everything. When Thomas hung up, he found Richard staring at him. "You're very interested in this housekeeper, aren't you?" Richard remarked. Thomas frowned. "She's going through a hard time, Richard. It's the least I can do." Richard shook his head. "Be careful, brother. Not everyone is who they seem." The next day, Emma returned to work, exhausted but grateful that Jake was stable. She started her tasks, trying not to think about the hospital bills piling up. Thomas found her in the hallway. "Emma, how's your son?" "Better, sir. Thank you for asking." Thomas hesitated, then said, "If you need help with the medical expenses." Emma was surprised by the offer. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, but something made her hesitate. "That's very kind, sir, but I can't accept." Thomas nodded, respecting her decision. He walked away, more determined than ever to uncover the truth about Emma. Richard watched the interaction with growing anger. His brother was getting too close to Emma. It was time to act. That afternoon, as Emma cleaned the living room, Richard burst in. "Emma, have you seen my mother's diamond necklace? It was here on the table." Emma, confused, shook her head. "No, sir. I haven't seen any necklace." Richard pretended to search the room, then turned to Emma. "Can I see your purse?" "My purse?" Emma asked, surprised. "Why?" "Just a routine check," Richard said with a fake smile. Reluctantly, Emma handed over her purse. Richard opened it and, with theatrical flair, pulled out the necklace. "What's this?" he exclaimed, feigning shock. Emma was speechless. I don't know how that got in there. I swear I didn't take it." Richard called for Thomas, who came running. "Thomas, look what I found in Emma's purse." Thomas looked from the necklace to Emma, his face a mask of confusion and disappointment. Emma, panicked, glanced between the two men. "Please, you have to believe me. I would never steal anything." Richard shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, Emma, but the evidence is clear. We'll have to call the police." Thomas, still in shock, couldn't speak. He wanted to believe Emma, But the necklace was there, in her purse. Emma began to cry. Please don't do this. My son, he needs me. I didn't steal anything, I swear. Richard picked up the phone, pretending to call the police. Thomas finally found his voice. Wait, Richard, maybe we should hear what Emma has to say. But Richard was already on the phone, ignoring Thomas's protests and Emma's sobs. The situation had blown up, just as Richard had planned. Now, he thought, Emma would be out of their lives for good, and his inheritance would be safe. The police arrived at the Blackwood mansion within minutes. Emma, still in shock, was taken to the local station for questioning. Please, I didn't do anything, Emma pleaded with the detective. I have a sick son in the hospital. I would never risk my job like that. The detective looked at her skeptically. The necklace was found in your bag, Mrs. Watson. How do you explain that? Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. Someone must have put it there. I would never steal. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Thomas was restless. Something didn't seem right. Richard, he said, are you sure you saw Emma take the necklace? Richard frowned. I didn't see her take it, but who else could it have been? She was alone in the room. Thomas wasn't convinced. He started reviewing the mansion's security cameras, determined to uncover the truth. At the hospital, Jake's condition was worsening. A nurse walked into the empty room. Where is this boy's mother? She asked a colleague. I don't know. She hasn't shown up today, the other replied. And the bills are overdue. We'll have to move him to a regular room. Jake, barely conscious, weakly called out for his mother. Back at the station, Emma was released, but with charges still pending. She rushed to the hospital, only to find that Jake had been removed from the ICU. Please, she begged the receptionist. He needs that care. I'll get the money, I promise. The receptionist looked at her with sympathy but shook her head. I'm sorry, but without payment, we can't keep him in the ICU. Emma collapsed into a chair, feeling completely defeated. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? At the mansion, Thomas continued his investigation. He noticed something strange in the footage. Richard entering the room just before Emma, carrying something small. Intrigued, Thomas confronted his brother. Richard, what were you carrying when you entered the room this morning? Richard paled for a moment but recovered. Nothing important. Why are you asking? Thomas narrowed his eyes. Because the cameras show you entering the room before Emma, holding something in your hands. Richard laughed nervously. It must be a mistake. You're seeing things, Thomas. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Thomas began to question everything he thought he knew about his brother. At the hospital, Emma held Jake's hand, softly singing to him. The boy was pale and weak, desperately needing the intensive care they could no longer afford. Mom, Jake whispered. When will I get better? Emma forced a smile through her tears. Soon, my love. You'll get better soon. At that moment, her phone rang. It was Thomas. Emma, he said, his voice serious. I need you to come to the mansion. We need to talk. Emma's heart raced. More trouble or maybe hope? I can't leave Jake alone, she replied. Bring him, Thomas said, surprising her. I have private doctors who can take care of him while we talk. Emma hesitated, then agreed. Any chance to help Jake was worth the risk. When they arrived at the mansion, Thomas greeted them personally. He looked at Jake, feeling an inexplicable connection to the boy. The doctors are waiting, he said gently. They'll take good care of him. As Jake was examined, Thomas led Emma to his office. Richard was there, looking nervous. Emma, Thomas began. After reviewing the evidence, I have reason to believe you were wrongly accused. Emma gasped, tears of relief welling in her eyes. Thank you for believing in me. Richard quickly intervened. Thomas, you can't be serious. The evidence is clear. Thomas turned to his brother, his eyes hard. Is it really, Richard? Because the cameras tell a different story. Richard paled. What cameras? What are you talking about? The security cameras, Richard. They show you entering the room before Emma, carrying something small, something that could be the necklace. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard looked from Thomas to Emma, his face a mask of panic. "This is ridiculous," he finally said. "You're going to believe this? This maid over your own brother?" Thomas sighed deeply. "Richard, I want to believe you. But the evidence—" At that moment, one of the doctors entered the office. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to talk about the boy. His condition is critical. He needs specialized treatment immediately." Emma sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Thomas looked at her, then at Richard, who still appeared panicked. It was at that moment that Thomas made his decision. He walked over to Emma and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Emma," he said softly, "I'll take care of everything. Jake will get the best treatment and we'll clear your name. You have my word." Richard exploded. "You can't do this. She's a thief." Thomas turned to his brother, his eyes filled with disappointment. "No, Richard. The only thief here is you, and we're going to find out why." Thomas faced Richard, his voice firm. "Enough lies. Why did you set Emma up?" Richard, cornered, tried to keep his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The cameras, Richard. We have everything recorded," Thomas pressed. Finally, Richard broke down. "All right, I planted the necklace, but it was for your own good, Thomas." "My good? How is accusing an innocent woman for my own good?" Richard hesitated, then blurted out, "She might be your long-lost daughter. Didn't you see the mark on her arm?" Thomas went pale. "You knew about this?" "Of course I did. And if she's your daughter, there goes my inheritance." Disgusted, Thomas ordered Richard to leave the mansion immediately. Meanwhile, Emma, relieved that Jake was receiving treatment, decided to search for answers about her past. She visited the orphanage where she grew up. "I'm sorry, Emma," the director said. "We don't have much information. You were left here as a baby." Emma sighed, disappointed. "Is there nothing? No details about who brought me here?" The director hesitated. "Well, there is one thing. The man who brought you left an envelope to be opened when you turned 30. Emma's heart raced. "I'm 30 now. Can I see that envelope?" At the hospital, Thomas arrived unexpectedly. He found Jake asleep and sat beside his bed. "Hey, Jake," he said softly. "I'm Thomas, your mom's friend." Jake slowly opened his eyes. "Where's my mom?" "She'll be back soon. She's taking care of something important," Thomas replied, feeling a strange connection to the boy. Jake smiled weakly. "Are you going to help my mom? She always seems sad." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "Yes, Jake. I'm going to help both of you." Back at the orphanage, Emma opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, there was a letter and an old photograph. "My dear daughter," the letter began, "if you're reading this, you've turned 30. There's so much I want to tell you." Emma read eagerly, tears streaming down her face. The letter spoke of an accident, a wealthy family, and a stolen baby. It mentioned a birthmark, 3 stars on the arm. Shocked, Emma looked at the photo. It showed a young couple holding a baby. The man was unmistakably a younger version of Thomas Blackwood. Back at the hospital, Thomas was talking to Jake when Emma arrived, pale and shaking. "Emma, what happened?" Thomas asked, concerned. Emma hesitated, looking from Thomas to Jake. I found out something about my past." Thomas stood up. "Can we talk outside?" In the hallway, Emma showed Thomas the letter and the photo. He read them, his hands trembling more with each word. "Oh my God," he whispered. "It's true. You're my daughter." Emma, overwhelmed, didn't know what to say. "I don't know how to process this." Thomas looked at her, tears in his eyes. "I've been looking for you for so long. And now—" He made a move to hug her, but Emma stepped back. "Sorry, it's just too much to take in." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Of course, take all the time you need." At that moment, a doctor approached. "Mr. Blackwood, we have Jake's test results." Emma and Thomas entered the room. Jake smiled when he saw them. "Jake," the doctor began, "we've discovered why you're sick. You have a rare genetic condition." Emma gripped Jake's hand, anxious. "Can it be treated?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, but the treatment is complex and expensive." Thomas stepped in immediately. "Money is no issue. Do whatever is necessary." Emma looked at Thomas, gratitude and confusion in her eyes. "Thank you, but why?" Thomas smiled gently. "Because Jake is my grandson, and you, Emma, are my daughter. We're in this together now." Jake, confused, looked between them. "Mom? What's going on?" Emma took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Jake, sweetheart, it looks like we've just found our family." Thomas stepped closer to Jake's bed. "That's right, champ. I'm your grandfather." Jake smiled, still not fully understanding. "Does this mean I'm going to get better?" Thomas nodded, emotional. "Yes, Jake. We're going to do everything we can to make sure you get better." Watching the interaction, Emma felt a whirlwind of emotions. Relief that Jake had a chance for recovery, gratitude toward Thomas, but also fear of the unknown. "Thomas," she said quietly, "this is all so sudden. I don't know." Thomas gently interrupted her. "I know, Emma. It's a lot to take in. Let's take it one step at a time, okay? Right now, the important thing is to take care of Jake." Emma nodded, grateful for his understanding. She looked at Jake, who was already excitedly chatting with Thomas about superheroes. At that moment, Emma realized her life had changed forever. The past she had been searching for was now right in front of her. But with it came new questions, new challenges. As she watched Thomas and Jake, Emma wondered what her new life would be like. As Thomas Blackwood's daughter, as Jake's mother, as part of a family she never knew she had. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Emma felt hope. She had a family, she had answers, and most importantly, Jake had a chance to get better. With a deep breath, Emma joined the conversation, ready to face whatever fate had in store for her and her newly discovered family. Thomas sat in his office, absent-mindedly spinning a business card between his fingers. It was from a genetic testing lab. He knew he needed to be sure, but he feared Emma's reaction. When Emma arrived for work, Thomas called her in. "Emma, our company is starting a new health program for employees. I'd like you to participate." Emma hesitated. "What does it involve?" "Just some routine exams, including a DNA test," Thomas replied, trying to sound casual. Emma frowned. "A DNA test? Why?" "To identify genetic predispositions to diseases," Thomas explained. "It's completely confidential, of course." Emma considered it for a moment. Part of her wanted to trust Thomas, but years of mistrust made her pause. "Can I think about it?" she asked. Thomas nodded, hiding his disappointment. "Of course, no rush." That afternoon, Emma received a call from the hospital. Jake's condition had worsened, and he needed urgent surgery. Emma rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding. She found Jake pale and struggling to breathe. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm scared." Emma took his hand, forcing a smile. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Mom's here." The doctor entered, his expression grave. "Mrs. Watson, Jake needs surgery immediately. There are complications we didn't anticipate." Emma felt the world spin. "But the costs." "Don't worry about that right now," the doctor interrupted. "The important thing is to save Jake." Emma nodded, dazed. As Jake was taken to surgery, she called Thomas. Thomas arrived at the hospital minutes later. He found Emma crying in the waiting room. "Emma," he said gently, sitting beside her, "Jake is strong. He's going to pull through." Emma looked at Thomas, seeing genuine concern in his eyes. In that moment, she made a decision. "Thomas," she began, "there's something I need to tell you about Jake." Thomas waited, his heart racing. "Jake," Emma hesitated, gathering her courage. Jake is your grandson. Thomas froze, processing the news. My grandson? But how? Emma took a deep breath. When I was 18, I got involved with a man. It was an abusive relationship. Jake is the result of that. Thomas felt a mix of shock, anger, and a strange sense of joy. Emma, I don't know what to say. I understand if this changes things, Emma said, lowering her eyes. Thomas took her hand. It changes nothing, Emma. It just makes our connection even more special. Tears streamed down Emma's face. Years of fear and distrust were beginning to melt away. Meanwhile, Richard, who had followed Thomas to the hospital, overheard the conversation from his hiding spot. His face twisted in anger. Hours passed. Thomas and Emma waited anxiously for news. Finally, the doctor appeared. The surgery was a success, he announced, but Jake is still not out of danger. The next 48 hours will be critical. Emma sobbed in relief. Thomas hugged her, feeling a strange sense of completeness. Can I see him? Emma asked. The doctor nodded. Briefly, he's still in recovery. As Emma went to see Jake, Thomas took the opportunity to make a phone call. I need the DNA test done as soon as possible, he told the lab. Richard, still hidden, smiled maliciously. He had a plan to stop the test from happening. In the days that followed, Emma practically lived at the hospital. Thomas visited regularly, bringing food and offering support. One afternoon, while Jake slept, Thomas brought up the test again. Emma, I know this is a difficult time, but the DNA test could help us better understand Jake's condition. Emma hesitated. Part of her wanted to believe in Thomas, to trust him completely, but years of trauma held her back. What if the test shows we aren't related? She asked quietly. Thomas held her hand. Emma, no matter what the results say, you and Jake are my family now. Nothing will change that. Moved, Emma nodded. Okay, let's do the test. On the day the samples were collected, Richard put his plan into action. He bribed a lab employee to switch the samples. Thomas and Emma took the test, unaware of Richard's sabotage. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the results. Meanwhile, Jake continued to recover. Each day he grew stronger. One afternoon, as Thomas played with Jake in the hospital room, Emma watched them. Seeing the bond between the two, she felt a pang of guilt for having kept the truth hidden for so long. Thomas, she called softly, can I talk to you for a moment? They stepped into the hallway. Emma took a deep breath. About Jake's father, she began. Thomas gently interrupted her. Emma, you don't have to explain anything if you don't want to. No, I need to, she insisted. You deserve to know the whole truth. Emma then told Thomas about her past, the abusive relationship, and the constant fear that made her run and hide for so long. Thomas listened intently, his heart heavy with the pain Emma had endured. Emma, he said when she finished, you're the strongest person I've ever known, and I promise, from now on, you and Jake will never be alone again. At that moment, Thomas's phone rang. It was the lab. The results are ready, he said to Emma, his heart racing. Emma nodded, squeezing Thomas's hand. Together they walked into Jake's room, ready to face whatever the future had in store for their new family. Thomas opened the envelope with the DNA test results, his hands trembling slightly. Emma watched, her heart pounding. Emma, Thomas said, his voice choked. The test confirms it. You're my daughter. Emma felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief, fear, joy, confusion. I don't know what to say, she murmured. Thomas embraced her, tears in his eyes. You don't need to say anything. We're together now. At that moment, Thomas's phone rang. It was his assistant, sounding nervous. Mr. Blackwood, we've got a problem. James Foster is here, and he's threatening to expose something about the company. Thomas frowned. James Foster was an old business partner known for his questionable methods. I'm on my way, he said, hanging up. Emma, I need to take care of this. We'll talk later, Thomas said, hurrying out. At the company, Thomas found James Foster in his office, a smug smile on his face. Thomas, my old friend, James said, I have some interesting information about your company. What do you want, James? Thomas asked, tense. James smiled. Let's just say I found some compromising documents. It'd be a shame if the press found out. Thomas felt a chill down his spine. What documents? Oh, you know, the ones related to that incident 30 years ago. When your daughter disappeared, James said casually. Thomas went pale. How do you... It doesn't matter how. What matters is what you're going to do to keep this quiet, James interrupted. Meanwhile, Emma was on her way home, still processing the news. On the way, she ran into Richard. Emma, darling, Richard said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. I heard the good news. You must be so happy. Emma stepped back, wary. What do you want, Richard? Richard smiled coldly. Just to talk. About your past, maybe? I know some interesting things. Emma froze. What are you talking about? Oh, you know, your abusive ex-boyfriend, for example. It'd be awful if Thomas found out all the sordid details, wouldn't it? Emma felt panic rising. You can't do this. I can and I will. Unless you convince Thomas to give me what I want, Richard threatened. Back at the company, Thomas struggled to keep calm. James, what happened 30 years ago was a terrible accident. We have nothing to hide. James laughed. Oh, Thomas, we both know there's more to the story. The secret deals, the money diverted to cover it all up. Thomas felt the weight of guilt. He had done things he wasn't proud of, all in a desperate attempt to find his daughter. What do you want? Thomas asked, defeated. Simple. I want my share of the company back. And a hefty sum to keep my mouth shut, James replied. Thomas knew he was cornered. If the truth came out, not only would his reputation be ruined, but Emma might hate him forever. Meanwhile, Emma arrived home, shaken by her encounter with Richard. She looked at Jake, sleeping peacefully, and felt fear. What if she lost everything because of her past? The phone rang. It was Thomas. Emma, we need to talk. It's urgent. Emma hesitated. Thomas, I have something to tell you too. They agreed to meet at the Blackwood mansion. When Emma arrived, she found Thomas looking years older, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Emma, he began, there's something I need to tell you about the past, about the day you disappeared. Emma sat down, tense. What happened? Thomas took a deep breath. That day I did things I'm not proud of, all to try and find you. He told her about the secret deals, the money used to bribe officials, the illegal investigations. Emma listened, horrified. Why are you telling me this now? She asked, her voice trembling. Because someone's threatening to expose everything. And I don't want you to find out from someone else, Thomas replied, his voice breaking. Emma was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she began to share her own story. About her abusive ex-boyfriend, her escape, the years spent living in fear. Thomas listened, his heart breaking for the pain his daughter had endured. When Emma finished, both were in tears. Emma, I'm so sorry. For everything, Thomas said, his voice choked. Emma took his hand. I'm sorry too, for not trusting you before. At that moment, Thomas's phone rang again. It was his assistant. Mr. Blackwood, the press is here. They're asking questions about a scandal involving your daughter's disappearance 30 years ago. Thomas and Emma looked at each other, panic rising. The past they had both tried to bury was about to come to light, threatening to destroy the fragile relationship they had just begun to rebuild. What are we going to do? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Thomas squeezed her hand. We'll face it together. No more secrets, no more lies. It's time for the truth, no matter how painful it is. They stood up. ready to face the storm ahead. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, they weren't alone. They had each other, and that would have to be enough. Thomas and Emma left the mansion, determined to face the press. On the way, Thomas received another call, this time from a private investigator he had hired years ago. "Mr. Blackwood, I found something. I need to see you immediately," the investigator said. Thomas looked at Emma. "We need to make a detour." At the investigator's office, they uncovered a shocking truth. Documents and photos revealed a conspiracy involving James Foster, Richard, and other former partners of the company. They planned everything, the investigator explained. Emma's kidnapping, the cover-up, all of it to manipulate you and the company. Thomas felt a growing fury. "I'm going to destroy them," he muttered. Emma touched his arm. "No, Dad, we can't stoop to their level." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Jake was rushed into emergency surgery. The doctor informed Emma over the phone. "Mrs. Watson, we've discovered a complication. Jake needs surgery immediately." Emma felt panic rising. "We're on our way," she said, looking at Thomas. On the way to the hospital, Emma made a decision. "I need to confront Richard," she said. Thomas hesitated. "It's dangerous, Emma." "Trust me," she replied, determined. At the hospital, while Jake was being prepped for surgery, Emma found Richard in the hallway. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, discreetly turning on the recording feature on her phone. Richard smiled arrogantly. "Come to beg, Emma?" "No," she replied firmly. "I came to hear the truth about what you did 30 years ago." Richard laughed. "You don't know anything." "I know more than you think," Emma bluffed. "About the kidnapping, about how you and James planned everything." Richard paled. "How did you—" "Confess, Richard. It's your only way out," Emma pressed. Surprisingly, Richard broke down. He confessed everything: how they had planned Emma's kidnapping to manipulate Thomas, how they had used company funds to cover it all up. "We never meant to hurt you," he said. "We just wanted to control Thomas." Emma, trembling, stopped the recording. "Thank you, Richard. That's all I needed." At that moment, Thomas appeared with 2 police officers. Realizing the trap, Richard tried to flee but was apprehended. As Richard was taken away, Jake's doctor appeared. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Watson, the surgery revealed something unexpected. Jake has a rare genetic condition." Emma felt her fear rising. "What does that mean?" "It means the treatment will be more complex," the doctor explained. "But it also gives us a clearer direction for his future care." Thomas hugged Emma. "We'll get through this together." In the weeks that followed, the truth came to light. James Foster, Richard, and the others involved were arrested. Thomas's company faced a crisis, but with transparency and determination, they began to rebuild their reputation. Jake was slowly recovering, his genetic condition now under proper treatment. Emma spent her days between the hospital and learning about the company, determined to help Thomas. One afternoon, while Jake was sleeping, Thomas found Emma in the hospital corridor. "How are you handling all of this?" he asked gently. Emma sighed. "It's hard. Sometimes it feels like a crazy dream." Thomas nodded. "I know how you feel, but I'm proud of you, Emma. You've shown incredible strength." Emma smiled, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Dad." It was the first time she had called him that, and Thomas's heart swelled with emotion. "You know," Emma continued, "for years I dreamed of finding my real family, but I never imagined it would happen like this." Thomas chuckled softly. "Life rarely follows the script we expect." At that moment, Jake's doctor approached, looking concerned. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Watson, we need to talk about Jake." They followed him to his office, fear growing with each step. "Jake's genetic condition is more complicated than we initially thought," the doctor explained. "He's going to need an experimental treatment." Emma gripped Thomas's hand tightly. "What's the risk?" The doctor hesitated. "It's a high-risk procedure. But without it, Jake's chances are limited. Thomas felt the weight of the decision. What are the chances of success? About 50%, the doctor replied. But it's the best option we have. Emma looked at Thomas, seeking strength. He squeezed her hand, offering silent support. We have to try, Emma said finally. For Jake. As they left the doctor's office, Emma stopped abruptly. Dad, she said, her voice trembling, what if we lose Jake? Thomas held her tightly. We won't lose him. Jake is strong, just like his mother. We'll fight together, as a family. Emma melted into the embrace, feeling, for the first time in years, the security of having a father. Back in Jake's room, they found him awake, smiling despite his pale complexion. Mom, Grandpa, he called weakly. You both look sad. Emma forced a smile. We're not sad, honey. Just thinking about how to make you even stronger. Jake smiled. I'll be strong, I promise. I want to play in the park with you both. Thomas ruffled Jake's hair affectionately. And we will, champ, as soon as you're better. As Jake drifted back to sleep, Emma and Thomas exchanged determined looks. They would face this new challenge together, as a family. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, there was hope. A hope born not just from love, but from the strength they had found in each other. Thomas walked into his office, exhausted. The scandal had spread, and the shareholders were panicking. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Mr. Blackwood, his assistant said, the board is demanding an emergency meeting. Thomas sighed. Schedule it for tomorrow. At the hospital, Emma anxiously waited for news about Jake. The experimental treatment was underway, but the doctors seemed worried. Emma's phone rang. It was Thomas. How's Jake? He asked. No change, Emma replied. The doctors say the next few hours are critical. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Emma, I need to tell you something. The company is in crisis. The board wants me to cover everything up. Emma was silent for a moment. What are you going to do? I don't know, Thomas admitted. If I don't do what they want, we could lose everything. But if I do, we'd be living a lie, Emma finished. Their conversation was cut short by a doctor rushing into Jake's room. Mrs. Watson, we need to talk. Emma hung up quickly. What happened? The doctor looked serious. The treatment isn't working as we hoped. Jake needs a bone marrow transplant urgently. Emma's world seemed to collapse. A transplant? But we need to find a compatible donor immediately, the doctor explained. You and Jake's father are the best options. Emma felt a knot in her stomach. Jake's father, her abusive ex, was out of the question. I'll take the test right away, she said. Meanwhile, Thomas faced the company's board. Accusations flew across the room. Blackwood, we need to bury this scandal now, one of the members shouted. Thomas stood his ground. We can't just cover up the truth. The truth? Another member scoffed. The truth will destroy this company. The debate continued to heat up until Thomas's phone rang. It was Emma. Dad, she said, her voice trembling. Jake needs a transplant. I'm not a match. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. I'm coming there now. He stood up, ignoring the protests from the board. This meeting is over. At the hospital, Thomas found Emma in tears. What can we do? He asked. You need to take the test, Emma explained. It's our last hope. Thomas nodded, determined. While they waited for the results, Emma decided to reveal Richard's recording. Dad, I have something that might help with the scandal, she said, showing him the recording. Thomas listened, shocked. Emma, this could save the company, but exposing this means exposing our family too, Emma finished. Before they could discuss it further, the doctor returned with the results. Mr. Blackwood, you're a match for Jake. A mix of relief and fear washed over them. The transplant would be risky for both Jake and Thomas. When can we start? Thomas asked without hesitation. Immediately, the doctor replied. But I must warn you, There are risks for the donor as well. Emma looked at Thomas, worried. Dad, you don't have to. Thomas gently interrupted her. Emma, he's my grandson. Of course I have to. As Thomas prepared for the procedure, his phone wouldn't stop ringing. The board, the press, everyone demanding answers. Emma held Thomas's hand. What are we going to do about the company? Thomas looked at Jake, unconscious in the hospital bed, then back at Emma. In that moment, he made his decision. The truth, he said firmly. We'll tell the whole truth. Emma nodded, tears in her eyes. Together? Together, Thomas confirmed. Before being taken into surgery, Thomas made one last call. Set up a press conference, he instructed his assistant. We're telling everything. The following hours were a blur of activity. As Thomas and Jake underwent surgery, Emma faced the press. With courage, she revealed the entire story. The kidnapping, the conspiracy, and the recent family meeting. She played Richard's recording, exposing the entire scheme. The reaction was immediate. The company's stock plummeted, but a wave of public sympathy rose for Emma and Jake's story. At the hospital, Thomas slowly woke up from the anesthesia. Emma was by his side, holding his hand. How's Jake? Were his first words. Emma smiled, exhausted but relieved. He's responding well to the transplant. The doctors are optimistic. Thomas relaxed, feeling a mix of pain and relief. And the company? Emma hesitated. The stocks fell, but people are on our side. They admire our honesty. Thomas closed his eyes, processing it all. We did the right thing, he murmured. Yes, we did, Emma agreed, squeezing his hand. In the days that followed, as Jake slowly recovered, Thomas and Emma worked together to rebuild the company. It was a time of intense change, but they faced every challenge united. A week after the surgery, Jake opened his eyes, stronger than ever. Mom? Grandpa? He called. Emma and Thomas rushed to his side, tears of joy in their eyes. We're here, sweetheart, Emma said, kissing his forehead. Jake smiled weakly. I had a dream. We were a happy family. Thomas held his grandson's hand. It wasn't a dream, champ. It's our reality now. As Jake drifted back to sleep, Emma and Thomas exchanged determined glances. They had faced the worst and survived. Now it was time to build the future they had always dreamed of, together as a family. Thomas entered the company's boardroom, facing the council for the last time. Gentlemen, I've made my decision, he announced. I'm resigning as CEO and handing over all evidence to the authorities. Chaos erupted in the room. Protests and threats echoed, but Thomas stood firm. It's the right thing to do, he said, walking out. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Emma watched Jake sleep. The boy was stronger but still fragile. A reporter knocked on the door of the room. Mrs. Watson, can we talk about your family story? The reporter asked. Emma hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but not here. Let's talk outside. During the interview, Emma shared everything. The kidnapping, the years apart from Thomas, the reunion, and Jake's illness. Her honesty moved the reporter, and soon the story was in every newspaper. Thomas arrived at the hospital, exhausted. How is he? He asked Emma. Better, she replied. The doctors are optimistic. Thomas smiled, sitting by Jake's bed. Hey, champ, he whispered. Grandpa's here. Jake slowly opened his eyes. Grandpa, he murmured. Did you save my life? Thomas felt tears well up. We saved each other, Jake. In the following days, Jake's recovery continued. Thomas spent every free moment at the hospital, learning how to be both a father and a grandfather. One afternoon, while Jake slept, Thomas and Emma talked in the hallway. How are you handling all this? Thomas asked. Emma sighed. It's hard. Sometimes I still have nightmares about the past, but having you and Jake helps. Thomas hugged his daughter. We're here for you always. The press continued to cover the Blackwood family story. Some criticized Thomas for his past actions, while others praised him for his recent honesty. "Dad," Emma said one day, "I think we should give an interview together, tell our story in our own way." Thomas agreed. The interview was scheduled for the following week. On the day of the interview, Thomas and Emma sat side by side, nervous but determined. The journalist started with simple questions, then delved deeper into their story. "Mr. Blackwood, do you regret the choices you made in the past?" the journalist asked. Thomas took a deep breath. "I regret many things, but I don't regret doing everything to find my daughter. The mistake was in the methods, not the intent." Emma held her father's hand. "We all make mistakes," she added. "The important thing is how we choose to correct them." The interview continued, revealing details never shared before. By the end, the journalist seemed moved. "You've been through so much," he commented. "How are you adjusting to life as a family?" Emma smiled. "Every day is a challenge, but it's also a blessing. We're learning together." Thomas nodded. "I've discovered that being a father and a grandfather is the hardest and most rewarding job I've ever had." After the interview, Thomas and Emma returned to the hospital. Jake was sitting up in bed playing with a puzzle. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Emma asked. Jake smiled. "Better, Mom. When can I go home?" Thomas laughed. "Soon, champ. Very soon." That night, after Jake fell asleep, Thomas found Emma quietly crying in the hallway. "What's wrong?" he asked, concerned. Emma wiped her tears. "I'm happy, Dad. For the first time in a long time, I'm truly happy. And that scares me." Thomas hugged his daughter. "I understand. But you deserve this happiness, Emma. We all do." In the days that followed, Jake's recovery sped up. The doctors were talking about his discharge. Thomas and Emma began planning for the future. "You can live with me," Thomas suggested. "The mansion is too big for just one person." Emma hesitated. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." Thomas smiled. "You're my family. You'll never be a burden." The move was scheduled for the following week. Emma and Jake were packing their things when the doctor entered the room looking concerned. "Mrs. Watson, Mr. Blackwood, we need to talk," he said seriously. Emma's heart raced. "What is it? Is Jake okay?" The doctor hesitated. "We found something in Jake's latest tests, a complication we didn't expect." Thomas felt a surge of fear. "What kind of complication?" "Jake's body is showing signs of rejecting the transplant," the doctor explained. "It's rare, but it happens. We'll need more tests and possibly another procedure." Emma felt her legs give way. Thomas held her up, keeping her on her feet. "What can we do?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling slightly. The doctor sighed. "For now, we'll increase the medication. But if the rejection continues, Jake may need another transplant." Emma looked at Jake, who was peacefully sleeping, unaware of the conversation. "He was doing so well," she whispered. Thomas embraced Emma and Jake, feeling the weight of worry. They had overcome so much, and now they faced another obstacle. "We'll get through this," Thomas said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We're a family now. We'll fight together." As the doctor left, Thomas and Emma exchanged determined looks. The future was uncertain, but they would face every challenge together. Their journey as a family was just beginning, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. After some tense days, Jake finally overcomes the transplant rejection and is discharged from the hospital. The family moves into the Blackwood mansion, starting a new chapter in their lives. Thomas establishes the Blackwood Foundation for Children, using his resources to help orphans and victims of abuse. Emma returns to the orphanage where she grew up, taking on the role of director and creating support programs. Jake makes a full recovery and goes back to school, achieving excellent grades. The family finds a new rhythm, each one dedicated to making a difference. In an emotional moment, they visit Thomas's mother's grave, giving thanks and reflecting on their journey. Emma expresses her gratitude for having found her family. Back at the mansion, a small surprise party celebrates the Blackwoods' unity. The night ends with Thomas and Emma on the porch, gazing at the stars and contemplating the promising future ahead of them. Bound by love and strengthened by trials, the Blackwoods embrace their new beginning, ready to face whatever challenges fate has in store. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to let us know. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us what other moving stories you'd like to hear. And to make sure you don't miss any of our inspiring tales, subscribe to the channel now. Remember, just like the Blackwoods, we all have the power to turn our trials into triumphs and write a new chapter in our lives.